Hi y'all, welcome back to Module 5. We are halfway through the course. We've made our way up to about 1920 in American history. So this section, Module 5, is going to be talking about sporting heroes and social change. We'll be pulling from GEMS chapters 8 and Wiggins chapters 10 and 11. The crux of our lecture is going to take into account sport, popular culture, and hard times. We'll be looking at the years of roughly 1920 through 1950. As we have learned throughout most of our American history courses, life in America from roughly 1920 to 1950 was shaped by hard times. As we know, this period is marked by war, including World War I and World War II, the Depression or our stock market crash. It was also characterized by this notion of isolationism. That is, at this point in time, there was no League of Nations. Thus, our country was isolated from others. Because of this, our immigrant populations feared deportation because there was threats from other countries to our own country, and these immigrants feared that they would be deported as a result of this. Following the Great Depression, the American government was active in enacting what they would call the New Deal programs. And in doing so, they inspired Americans and gave them hope for the future. A number of ways these programs impacted sport included that there was stadium construction and the construction of sporting fields, things like swimming pools and playgrounds, parks and gyms, and winter sports facilities were all enacted throughout this New Deal programs in order that Americans could be involved in sport and physical activity. Just as we've seen in prior lectures and in prior time frames throughout our American sporting history, sport is throughout this time a space for social change. One, it offered an avenue for various groups to express social change. Social reformers used sport, to push for social justice. In addition, sport was an area or an arena that accommodated religious groups. The examples here give an indication of Notre Dame football, Catholic youth organizations or CYOs, and as well as Jewish American basketball and boxing. And finally, sport was a space for social change for racial groups. Throughout sport, blacks were able to move up the social ladder, and this was experienced in the Harlem Globetrotters, the New York Rens, as well as the Negro Leagues. And just a small teaser going forward, we will know as one of the biggest impacts that we will see in sport comes shortly with the inclusion of Jackie Robinson into baseball. Throughout this time frame, baseball sought to reassert itself as the great American pastime. A couple ways they did this. First, baseball sought to shore up the game itself. This was shortly following the Black Sox scandal, and many had lost their faith in the game of baseball. Therefore, the commissioner took greater control to ensure that there was fairness. Also, baseball changed a couple of the rules. One, they banned the spitball. As a result of this, individuals like Babe Ruth exerted or showed his power in hitting. Obviously, he's famous for calling home runs. With even the figures like Babe Ruth, this resulted in the creation of this hero sporting culture. Athletes themselves became heroes. The second major thing that baseball did to return the game to the great American pastime is they made the game more American. Baseball was one of the first sports to add the Star-Spangled Banner to the pregame rituals. In addition, as we will note, Jackie Robinson was ultimately included into the game of baseball. Not only did this improve race relations, it also improved national morale. Throughout the 1920s through about the 1950s, sport was used as a political tool. That tool was used at home and abroad, and for the most part surrounded issues of race. Outside of those issues of race, though, Sport was used as a political tool for the game of baseball as they pushed through antitrust exemptions in 1922, and that exemption still holds today. Also, at home, sport was used as a political tool as we saw American black athletes dominating international competition. However, when those heroes came home, they still did not receive a hero's welcome. How sport was a political tool abroad, we saw competing ideologies in international sport. Americans used sport as a way to show dominance and power. Two key examples: Joe Louis, who lost to Max Schmeling in 36, avenged that loss in 1938. Americans used that as a way to show their dominance. And maybe the most popular example of this is Jesse Owens embarrassing Hitler in his 1936 Olympic Games. However, as I just mentioned prior, these athletes, particularly when they came home, did not receive the same accolades they did when they were abroad. That is, Lewis and Owens were not treated as equals, even though America sought them out and used them to show their dominance and power over other nations. As I mentioned in the prior slide, one of the key figures throughout this era when we saw sport used as a political tool was Joe Louis. Recall that Joe Louis showed or displayed American dominance when he beat Max Schmeling. It's important to know, though, Run Stetler does a really wonderful job in Chapter 10 of Wiggins to recount the importance of the rise of black male sporting figures. These figures represented an integral symbol of black success. Boxers were key and were used often as political figures. Lewis and many other boxers, we know even modern day Muhammad Ali, weren't just fighting an opponent in a ring, but they were fighting against oppression. Furthermore, oftentimes these popular black figures were viewed not only as representing and fighting for example, the U.S. or themselves, but they were fighting for their entire race. We know today that the Olympics are used to show and personify the strength of individual nations. You can argue that this started as early as the 1932 Olympics in the U.S., as we as Americans used this Olympic Games as a political tool. In Wiggins Chapter 11, Dinses goes on to show that America sought to prove their dominance, and they did this by shoring up American powers, and organizers pushed in order to create this event as a mega event. Even though throughout this time frame the country was involved in tension and racial divide, you can argue that the organizers pushed for putting on a happy face, a face of cultural diversity. Remember then, as we talked prior with Hitler's 1936 Olympics, Hitler sought to prove his own dominance, or his country's dominance, in that games that followed this. And as we can remember, Jesse Owens was key in showing up Hitler and his Olympics. Throughout the 1920s through roughly the 1950s, what was the state of intercollegiate athletics? First, intercollegiate athletic teams were being strengthened as soldiers returned home from war. As a result of this, college sport increased in popularity and commercialization. And we know with popularity and commercialization, there is no shortage of scandal. Coaches were being paid, and the NCAA was concerned about this. They instituted the 1948 Sanitary Code. The purpose of this was to gain control over the growing enterprise of college sport. It also wanted to ensure amateurism of the athletes, as well as enforce some type of academic standards. On an interesting note, in 1950, Army athletes were expelled for cheating, and in 1951, 7 universities were involved in points shaving scandals in intercollegiate athletics. Again, even in the early 1920s to roughly 1950s, college sport was not short on scandal. Following the Great Depression, golf experienced growth, and in doing so, they maintained issues of social class. The cost of membership fees and equipment to play the game of golf still kept out minority and working class groups. It also is important to note that during this time, the sporting hero culture was boosted by the likes of Walter Hagen, Bobby Jones, Ben Hogan, and Sam Snead. In Module 4, we gave some time and spent time talking about how women were using sport as a way to break or push gender boundaries. This fight continues to go on in roughly the 1920s through the 1950s. One of those ways is women still were experiencing what we called as those myths and misconceptions, as the American Physical Education Association discouraged competition for girls. They deemed it to be bad. The alternative they had were these notion of play days. A couple of things that were important throughout this time, though, is that Iowa girls basketball became very competitive. It was 6-on-6. Furthermore, Babe Didrikson and Amelia Earhart were key female figures that added to this hero culture. And lastly, during World War II, the All-American Girls Baseball League played. For many of you, I'm sure you have seen the film with Tom Hanks called A League of Their Own. I think that often comes to mind, whether a perfect and true depiction of this time or not. It does give us some images of that All-American Girls Baseball League. We know today that media and sport have a strong symbiotic relationship. They rely heavily on each other. When did this begin? The 1920s. At this point, the radio is introduced and it gains popularity. Sport was often common material for radio broadcast, and throughout this time, networks that owned newspapers formed media conglomerates, and they continued to publish sporting sections. So, the sporting heroes for these individuals came from those sports writers and radio announcers. They were your celebrities. With the rise of the connection of media and sport, also came early commercialization. One, athletes and coaches were becoming increasingly marketable. As a result of this, there was some stadium construction, and this spurred sporting consumption. However, following the Great Depression, as it makes sense, there was a decrease in disposable income. Therefore, sporting organizations made attempts to generate or increase interest. For that, they did all-star games in both baseball and football. They provided some night baseball games to drive attendance and generate interest. And we even see the early formation of bowl games. It should not be surprising that we have seen the media increase and commercialization increase, and ultimately professional sport emerged. The All-American Football Conference was formed in 1946. It ultimately merged and became the NFL in 1949. The Basketball Association of America, or the BAA, merged with the National Basketball League, the NBL, to form what we know today as the NBA. This took place also in 1949. As I talked earlier, we have a rise of media. Sport began to transition from radio to televised. The 1936 Olympics were the first telecast. Football and baseball telecasts began in 1939. Although it is really interesting to note, because of the cost of televisions, large numbers of Americans did not own TVs until the mid-50s. So, although those sports were being telecast, they were not widely viewed by Americans until roughly the mid-50s. And here we are, we've arrived at the end of our lecture for Module 5. Here are some questions for thought. Again, use these as fact-checking as well as ways to think about how you might apply the concepts talked about in this lecture.